Representative Cody Harris of Palestine has filed a bill that would require teachers convicted of having an improper relationship with a student to register as sex offenders.
Yeah, that's right. He calls the current criminal code a loophole currently. KLTV's Cody explains why.
Our goal should be to protect our kids. They're the most innocent among us.
It's a rule, or lack of one, that surprised Representative Cody Harris of Palestine.
I was really shocked to find out that if a teacher is convicted of having an inappropriate relationship with a student, that they're not required to be on the sex offender registry.
His bill, HB1401, aims to fix that. Under current law, teachers would have to register if they're convicted of crimes like sexual assault, possession of child pornography, or similar crimes. The bill adds the charge of improper relationship with a student.
When parents drop their kids off at school, the last thing that goes through their mind is that they would be taken advantage of in a sexual manner by any of the people that they're putting their trust in.
Harris was alerted to the issue after a case in his district. This is Adrian Alonzo, the former band director at Palestine High School. Last year, he received an 11-year prison sentence for an improper relationship with one of his students. Police said the relationship included sexual contact.
The person who's now been convicted doesn't have to register as a sex offender even though they took advantage of a student.
Improper relationship with a student is a second-degree felony under Texas law, which can lead to up to 20 years in prison.
I thought, you know what, this is a simple law that needs to be changed. They should absolutely be held to account for what they did.
J.D. Conti, KLTV 7 News.
By the way, no action has been taken on the bill so far. Harris says he expects committee assignments to be made sometime this week. Another bill